Murdered British student Meredith Kercher's relatives say they're struggling to come to terms with the verdict.
We said all along we don't want the wrong people put away for a crime that they didn't commit.
And what happened to my daughter Meredith is every parent's nightmare.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler, former New York City prosecutor, and writer-producer on Criminal Minds. And with me today is...
Laura Richards, founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service and author of the book Policing Domestic Violence and former criminal behavioural analyst from New Scotland Yard.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti, and I'm the casting director for Criminal Minds and Criminal Minds Beyond Borders, and I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes.
Well, today we're talking about the case of the murder of Meredith Kercher. This happened in Perugia, Italy, and it created a meteor firestorm. Just so everybody knows the facts of what actually happened to Meredith Kercher on November 1st, 2007. She was an exchange student in Perugia, Italy. One of her roommates was Amanda Knox. She had two other students, also females, living in the apartment with them that they shared the flat with. And then downstairs, there were guys who had an apartment. They were situated on a hillside overlooking Perugia, and it was a college town, basically.
Very picturesque
Yes.
looking town, all those little cobblestone streets. And
on the night of the first, Amanda Knox spent the evening and the night with Rafael Sollecito, her newfound boyfriend. They had met about 5 days earlier. They were sort of being very romantic and hanging out and just, being kids in love and spending as much time together as they could. A couple days earlier had been Halloween, and they all kind of celebrated and did their thing. Amanda was working at a bar, and she had gotten a message from her boss that she did not have to come in that night, and therefore she spent the night with Rafael. The next morning, she got up and went back to her apartment, and she showered, and when she was approaching the apartment, she noticed that the flat door was open. So the actual door to their apartment was open, and she thought that was a little strange, but closed it and didn't see anything else out of place. She showered, and then as she was leaving the shower, she noticed that there was kind of a reddish footprint on the bath mat in the bathroom. And that got her a little bit concerned, and then...
There were a few spots of blood in the basin as well, but she didn't really think too much of the ones in the sink. It was more when she was looking on the bath mat.
When you're brushing
in
your
my
teeth.
house, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So then she walked out into the main area and saw that in the other bathroom, that in the toilet, somebody had used the toilet, and there was some serious number 2 in there. And that got her a little concerned because nobody that she knew would
you're
have
living with a bunch of girls. You're not going to...
not flush the toilet. So the toilet had not been flushed, and so she was a little concerned about that. And then she felt, oh my God, was somebody actually in the apartment while I was here? And when we talk later about Rudy Guedes' MO, we'll get into that about what he did in prior crimes that he was suspected of and connected to. At that point, she got very scared, and she went back to Rafael's apartment. And when she got there, she told Rafael, and he came back to Amanda's flat with her. They went inside. They looked around, and they noticed that Meredith Kercher's door was locked, and that was apparently unusual, so they knocked on the door. No answer, so they started calling her. Still no answer. They tried again and again, And I believe that's the time at which they discovered that there was a big rock that had been thrown through the window of their other roommate's bedroom, and there was glass all over the place, and the windows had actually been opened, and they realized that something nefarious must have happened. And actually, it was Raphael who called the police, the Carabinieri, the federal police, and he called them. He told her. She said to call the local police, and then he did that. Now, short time later, the local police arrived. What Raphael and Amanda didn't know was that they were actually called by somebody else. They found 2 cell phones. I believe one of them was Meredith Kircher's in the garden outside their house or apartment, and they called the police about that. That's why the police had responded. And so Raphael and Amanda thought these were the police that were responding because of the call, so they didn't say much to them about it because they had made the report over the phone. And so there was a little bit of a cross-communication. The police were coming to question them about who took these phones and tossed them, and they thought they were coming to kick in the door. So they didn't want to kick in the door. They did want to kick in the door. They kind of went back and forth for a while, and eventually I think the Carabinieri came. Somebody came and kicked in the door, and that's when Amanda and Raphael were told to go outside. They did not go into Meredith Kircher's room. They did not see what was in there. They may have been told that there was a foot visible under a blanket, and that's all. And that's when they were outside. And that's when the infamous video and photographs of them hugging and kissing were made. Before they knew what had actually happened, they were afraid, but they didn't know exactly what had gone down or the condition that Meredith was in, or that she was even dead.
And they had been calling her inside. You know, Amanda had been calling out for her, and with no answer, and the door was locked. And that's as far as they went, as far as going into.
Yeah, they did not kick in a door. Although Raphael, I believe, tried. He didn't. He was a little worried about kicking it in because it's destruction of property, and he didn't want to do that. And I think the police said exactly the same thing. They didn't want to do it, but eventually they did. And we here, the police do this all the time, and we call it a welfare check. When somebody's not responding and there's a situation in which there's concern about their safety, then the police can kick in the doors and find out whether or not they're okay. And they eventually did it. But at that point, the prosecutor arrived, or shortly before that, the prosecutor arrived, and we saw him in this documentary make some pronouncements about what he observed and so forth. They questioned Amanda and let her go, and then they had Raphael come down to the precinct, and Amanda went with him. And they ended up questioning both of them long into the night, and at the end of that situation, they were arrested, and they would not get out of jail for, I think, at least 3 years from that day forward.
Do we know if they questioned the other roommates at all when they came home? And was the spotlight also on anybody else around there?
I believe the roommates were traveling for the holiday weekend or something like that.
An ironclad alibi or something? Or?
Yeah, I believe they were not questioned at all. But Amanda was new to this apartment situation, and having Meredith as one of her flatmates, they were apparently friendly, but they weren't really tight friends.
No.
They hadn't yet had time to do that, or maybe the inclination to do that. I don't know. But the fact is that they knew each other. They, obviously Amanda was concerned enough when she saw these things out of place and Meredith's door locked that she was concerned enough for her safety to have Raphael call the police. Yeah. So she did care about her, at least as demonstrated by her actions.
I just want to say that when I lived in London, I had many flatmates, and some you're closer to, some you're not. You see some when you're making dinner or coming in and out, and there were some that just kept to themselves. And if their door was closed and locked for the weekend, they were either with a boyfriend or they were sleeping it off. Or there were certain boundaries that you wouldn't necessarily cross, even if you didn't see anybody all weekend. So,
and just because you live together, that doesn't make you, great friends or mean that you know a lot about each other. And it seems that actually didn't really know much about each other. And weren't really in each other's lives other than sharing, a home space together.
Yeah, they seemed to be two young ladies who were there as exchange students who were young and dynamic and full of life. And so they had a lot of similarities that way. And neither of them were murderous, crazy, devilish people like
They weren't having fights or conflicts or anything to suspect that there was any animosity.
No, but down the road, you would see the prosecutor coming up with a theory that Amanda owed Meredith $300, and that was the reason why Amanda killed Meredith Kercher. And it made absolutely no sense, nor did the sex games gone wrong make any sense, nor would some premeditated, satanic devil worship stuff, that kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. It had nothing. It had no basis in fact or science or law, but these were the kinds of theories that would come out and be posted as fact on those tabloid newspapers and across the media.
And of course, many people had a role to play in that.
Yeah.
It's the things that are pontificated on that then become, fact and evidence in the zeitgeist. And of course, this had a very serious impact on the criminal justice system and the outcome of the trial. And of course, that's all played out within the documentary, and it's all based on supposition of how someone should behave or what you would expect to see, or when someone's being interviewed. And I still go back to, a year out is a really exciting time and a real adventure, and this is one of the most exciting times, I think, when you don't have the responsibility of work or a job, but you're going out exploring and meeting new people and going to new places. And, both Amanda Knox and Meredith Kercher very much shared in that whole, joie de vivre and zest for life, that they had their whole lives ahead of them. And that's what makes it so tragic in so many senses.
Yeah, and there's one other person that I think bears mentioning at this point when we're introducing the different players in this case, and that's Patrick Lumumba. He owned the club that hired Amanda Knox. I believe he felt that having an American girl, young, good-looking American girl, working at his club might bring in business. And so he hired her. And on that fateful night that Meredith Kercher was killed, he texted Amanda saying, "It's not really that busy. You don't have to come in tonight." And she said, "Okay," something to the effect of "great." And then she said these fateful words, "See you later." Now, in the United States, we're very used to that term. And "see you later" means goodbye. And it could mean that I'll see you.
Literally seeing you later on.
It could mean, literally could mean if we have a plan to meet up in 2 hours, then I'll see you later. It could also mean goodbye, and we have no current plans to get together, but I know at some point I'll see you later. And I know my friends from Africa who say when they're leaving the house, they say, "I'll be back just now." And to me, that means you'll be back right now, like immediately. And to them, it could mean 2 days later, that they're leaving, but they'll be back.
Right.
Just now is just sort of an added thing that doesn't mean just now.
And the British phrase too, "see you later" is the same as what we understand it in America, but the literal translation of how it can be interpreted from one country to another.
Right, and they took it, in Italy, the police took it as they had a firm plan to meet up later in the night, and that Patrick came over to the house. And so the police kept badgering Amanda Knox about that, and eventually she would point the finger at Patrick and say, "Well, he came to the house then," because they kept telling her over and over and over again that "we know he came and met you there. We know he was involved." This is before they knew about Rudy Guede. Yeah. And so they wanted a monster. And so they didn't think that they could pin it just on Amanda and Raphael. So they were looking for another actor. And the reason why they were looking for somebody like Patrick Lumumba is that he happened to be black. And there had been an eyewitness that stated that they saw a black male leaving that premises that night. So they were looking for a black male. Patrick happened to be black. He had texted Amanda that he would see her later. So they thought they had made a conclusion about the evidence of what it meant, and they did not listen to Amanda saying, no, in America, what that means is just goodbye, good
But
night.
also in that text, doesn't it not only say see you later, but it says buona notte or something. It says something like good night or have a good evening. So not only was she saying, see you later, have a good, she's also saying have a good evening, which means I'm not going to see you tonight. So have a good night.
I don't recall that being in the text. It may be, but it could have been her practicing her Italian because she was there to be immersed in Italian. And so it could very well have been. But the fact is that the police latched onto that see you later as if it were literally translatable as we have a definite meeting that we're going to make.
And what was interesting, I would call this an epistemic imbalance again, that so much emphasis was placed on that rather than, we all saw it through the crime scene video. There was so much forensic evidence, that was available to them, that why they weren't concentrating on that would tell them, far more because, and a reminder, this was a brutal sex crime. It was a brutal sexually motivated crime. And so the crime scene evidence that was available was significant.
Yes.
And, so to bring in people who did understand something about crime scene behaviour, like the FBI, New Scotland Yard, others to work with them, rather than have some, a cadre of people who had never worked major crime before. It just had that real sense that they were just grasping at straws and were looking at the wrong end of the telescope throughout the whole investigation, if you can even call it an investigation.
Right, you can't really. And we'll get into this much later, and I apologize for the graphic nature of what I'm about to say, but some of the evidence there, and we've talked about DNA evidence, and we'll go into a lot more detail because there's a lot of issues with DNA evidence in this case, but there was actually sperm left there at the crime scene by Rudy Guede. And that should be a very important clue because of the sexual nature of this crime. When you find sperm from somebody there at the crime scene, then that is a connection to the actual crime that occurred. Like in other cases where people find DNA from other people, trace DNA, and then they automatically assume that's the offender. Well, in this case, there's a very strong connection because the type of crime it was the type of DNA evidence that was found. And that should have been paramount. Like Laura said, there's so much actual forensic evidence here, but the way it was collected. And do you know that they decided deliberately not to test the DNA, the swabs that were done of Meredith Kercher's vaginal area, in this case, to, quote, protect her reputation. It is unbelievably mind-boggling how they could make that kind of a determination, how they could say that in a rape case, that we are not going to test the DNA to protect the reputation of the victim.
That tells you everything about what they think about women and
having sex.
Yeah.
Exactly. It does tell you everything. And because of that, they refused to do those tests. Outrageous.
I can't believe that.
But the fact is that unfortunately, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it appears that based on the crime scene and the forensics and the autopsy, that Rudy Guede pulled a knife to rape Meredith Kercher. She fought him off valiantly, and he basically slashed her throat and then raped her. And so he is basically raping a young lady who is dying. And it's horrific. It's a terrible crime. And for that crime, just so you know, he ended up getting 16 years in prison, for which he was eligible to be released on day passes for parole last year. So after 7 years, he was able to be out, and he could go to college and take classes if he wanted during the day. This was a horrific crime, and because of the machinations and the plea deal and the subsequent to plea deal things that the prosecutor did in this case. Rudy Guede got basically a slap on the wrist for what he did to Meredith Kercher, and I think that's the ultimate slap in the face to the victim, and it's clear what Mignini really wanted was the notoriety of this case, and he didn't give a damn about the victim.
I agree. I mean, I just find it an utter disgrace on so many levels, you know, of trying to fit, when you've got so much overwhelming evidence where you could do a proper crime scene assessment and do the forensics and actually bring the case in a right way, to try and fit things to it that clearly do not fit your theory, and then leak it to the media and actually change the whole future trajectory of not just the family of Meredith Kercher, but also of many other families who are all swept up in this. And for Guede to be sort of let off the hook in many senses, yes, he got his 16 years, but no one was talking about him and what a dangerous and violent offender he was. And that's why I gave a nod to how brutal this crime was, because actually I don't think many people really understood what was done to Meredith.
That's
and
why I went into it, yeah.
Huge respect, you know, to her and to her family, and that's not the reason why it hasn't been covered. It's much more about what people were trying to make fit. But if you understand the crime scene, then you understand it's someone very violent and dangerous who's committed this offence. You know, and the question has to be asked about, you know, if he's on day release, Guede, what kind of rehabilitation has been going on, whether he's on a sex offenders register, because of course he fled straight after this crime. He took off to Germany and he actually had to be extradited.
Right.
So how many other women has he abused? Has he potentially raped before Meredith Kercher? But also now, you know, what happens in terms of him coming out and him being a dangerous offender? That's what people should be focusing on. Mm-hmm. And he's the person that people should be campaigning to ensure, you know, is properly assessed. And is he still a risk to the public? Because certainly this crime scene says that absolutely he was. And the focus on Amanda Knox and Raphael was a total distraction. And that distraction that everybody's still talking about without really understanding the crime scene, what was done to Meredith, her voice in the process. But, you know, has justice really been done? Well, in my view, absolutely not, because the real, perpetrator, there's been no real dialogue on at all.
Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
And do you know, Laura, as we sit here, what questions the family has, what's still unanswered for them, what's still like unclear that we might be able to help clear up?
I actually don't know the detail of it, other than I've seen a couple of the interviews that they've given. Certainly Mum, Arlene and Stephanie, the sister, you know, have said a number of things about questions that they have, but they didn't say exactly what the detail was. And I think one of the articles was in the Mirror in October. So this month, I think it was around the 15th, that Stephanie gave a particular interview. And I think it really is down to the fact that they don't really understand, you know, what happened in terms of the crime scene, the investigation itself. You know, they've been beholden, I think, from what I can ascertain, to things that they read about in the media too. Mm-hmm. I don't know, you know, the detail about their family liaison officer, because our process works quite differently in that, the family would have a family liaison officer. Now, whether they actually went out to Italy with the family or not is another question. But normally that family liaison officer would give them all the information and detail that the family need to know about what happened and keep them up to date in the investigation. But, to me, I can only, think that because there wasn't a real investigation, there was just so many things that were leaked to the media that became fact, that they probably do have these unanswered questions of where Amanda Knox and Raphael actually fit in, and what happened with, Patrick, for example, and what was the evidence against Rudy Guide. And, they certainly said, and I thought it was very moving, that they wanted to remember her as the part of family that she was, and that, Mum's only response to identifying her, she wanted to kiss her daughter goodbye. And, I get the impression that they were swept up in the whole process and were sort of on the outside of it too. I think being in a foreign country where you have, need translation or translators and interpreters, etc., that things do get lost in translation. But I think, this would be a case where, of course, we would, Jim, I'm speaking for you now, be very willing to sort of unpick some of the detail of what we know about and convey that and speak with the family so that they can get a much more comprehensive understanding of what went on.
Right. I mean, because when I looked at this case, I had no idea in what the circumstances were. But when I did a crime scene analysis by looking at the crime scene videotapes that were available online and the crime scene photographs, and when I started reading the motivations that the court had published after they reached one verdict or another, I was just shocked. I was shocked at what the kinds of statements that were made. And then, of course, after that point, reading what the different statements of the forensic scientists who testified, one particular forensic scientist who testified, and how they misused the machinery that they had and the technology that they had available to the point where the results were meaningless. And getting that brings us back to that bra clasp that was handled repeatedly by these crime scene technicians and maybe even the forensic scientist who led the lab, that clasp then was tested, and they found the DNA from a number of males on that bra clasp. A number, not just DNA from Raphael, but from a number of other males, which if that meant that if Raphael was involved, that it's also potential that several other males were involved in this. And it's outrageous, and it's clear that was noise from the machine, and it wasn't, and it was contamination, and it wasn't the fact that Raphael was there, because in fact he wasn't there at all during this crime, and the only thing that he did was try to help get in that door to find out if Meredith Kercher was okay, and he most likely left his DNA on that doorknob. And one of the crime scene investigators who had handled that clasp before that grabbed that doorknob, that same doorknob, to open it, to get into that room, and got Raphael's DNA on his gloves and then put it onto that clasp inadvertently, I'm sure, but it was found there. But then the same exact kind of ridiculous, inept, I can't even find enough adjectives to accurately describe the search of Raphael's house, in which they went in and they opened one of the kitchen drawers and they found the biggest butcher knife they could find, and they put that knife alone into a plastic bag. And there were other knives of different shapes and sizes in that same drawer, and they left them there. Why? Because they wanted a weapon that looked evil and menacing, and they took only that weapon. And Magnini's statement was that was the only weapon that was consistent with the wounds on Meredith Kercher, and that is an absolute lie. Forensically, that is not possible to determine. It's an open wound. It was a slashing wound across her neck. All you'd need is some straight edge, sharp instrument to make that wound, and you cannot tell the shape of the knife based on that kind of wound. It's only if the wound is a puncture wound that you can tell the shape, the width, the size, the pointedness, the edge, the serrated or non-serrated edge, based on a puncture wound where it actually goes into a person. This was a slashing wound, and it's not possible to make that determination from that wound on Meredith Kercher's neck. So because of that, we know that it was a sham going into that house and picking up one knife, and then making a statement afterwards that Meredith Kercher's blood DNA was found on the blade, and Amanda Knox's DNA was found on the handle. Amanda Knox's DNA may very well have been found on the handle because she was chopping vegetables, she said, while she was cooking at Raphael's house, and put the knife back away, probably just washed off the blade, and then held the handle and put it back into the
And
drawer.
DNA could have been on all the knives.
It very well could have
all
been.
forks and spoons and everything else.
Absolutely. And so, but it later was determined that, in fact, that was not Meredith Kercher's blood DNA on that knife. It wasn't Meredith Kercher's DNA at all on that knife. And that was another total misinterpretation of the evidence. In fact, that knife was tested along with how many other pieces? Like
50 other items.
Of Meredith Kercher's DNA beforehand. And so it's very possible that was, if they did read that when they were testing that knife, that it was just contamination. And it's not possible, though that machinery was used above and beyond its actual capability to make those conclusions. And that is, again, there's no science that backs it up. And therefore, it's meaningless testimony. And in fact, in the end, that would be what the Supreme Court decided when it finally not only dismissed the charges against Raphael and Amanda, but actually said there was never any evidence at all tying them to that crime. There was no forensic evidence, period, that the evidence that they claimed tied them to the crime was actually non-existent.
But that's what makes it just so outrageous, I think, Jim C. You know, talking about how brutal and violent this murder was. And when you compare it to the sample size of those two profiles, you know, that were so small that they were almost, you know...
They were microscopic.
Exactly. So when you look at that, even if you know nothing else about the case, you would expect there to be far more forensic evidence. As we saw, you know, Guidet's DNA was in about 8 different places. And this is a crime where...
In the room where the murder took place.
Correct. And, you know, this was a crime where you can see that whoever committed it was not criminally sophisticated. And we know that from the feces that was in the toilet. You know, all of these things that tell us whoever did it was not concerned about being caught.
Yeah, the forensic sophistication was extremely low. It was a very crude crime in so many ways, not only the way he gets in, but... And this is a good time probably to talk about his MO, right? I mean, what he would do to break into homes or offices is he would throw a rock, something through a second-story window, which are usually less guarded than first-story windows, and he would hide. And if nobody raised the alarm, if somebody went yelling and screaming and alarms went off, then he would run away. Mm-hmm. But if nobody came, then he would scale to the second floor and climb in that window that he had just broken. And that's exactly what he did in this case. And because of that, there is glass strewn over things, pieces of glass from the big stone that he hefted through that window, and glass on the bed and so forth. It was tracked around in that room, which is an indicator that somebody came in through that window and tracked it around. But immediately, McNeely said that he made a determination that was staged. The thing is, it's very old technology. It's been around for many, many years. You can actually reconstruct the glass from the pieces of glass. You can look at the actual glass that's left in the window, and you could determine whether it was broken from the inside out or the outside in.
It's got break pattern that happens.
Yes, and you can actually see from microscopic examination of the actual glass how it was broken or how it wasn't broken. And that was not done in this case.
Right.
So they skipped the technology that's readily available and made a determination based solely on his ego and his lack of experience.
Well, I mean, it's more so than that, isn't it? Because all of the forensic evidence that was available, you know, he took a view of what was relevant to his case and ignored all the other things. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that's the point that, you know, when it's 4 years later and the independent forensic report comes out, you know, and that's interesting, it's independent. The experts who look at it have no connection or relations with the key players in the case. You know, and they talk about how you have to be objective and scientific. You can't just interpret whatever you want to interpret
To
from a
fit your
crime scene
theory.
to fit your theory, and ignore and negate all the other things that tell you something else. And that's what this case to me is all about. If you had no forensic science background at all, and yet you saw that the minuscule sample of Meredith Kircher's DNA on the knife that allegedly is used to kill her, and you see the crime scene and what that knife allegedly did, how you could ever think that that knife was the knife that was used anyway, and the fact that Amanda Knox, a tiny bit of her DNA is found on it. The sample is so small that it's inconclusive, and it shows that it's unreliable and should not be used.
It shows that it's transfer evidence.
Absolutely, and
Not primary evidence.
You don't need to be an expert to know
No.
that, and that's why I do feel that it really is just so outrageous in the way that things have been interpreted to make everything fit, which of course nothing did fit at all. There are so many possibilities of what could have happened with this case, wild possibilities, and yet the probability was the most obvious thing in many senses, that somebody did break in. When you look at the crime scene again, at the video, and you look at what was available, that somebody did break in and they happened upon Meredith on her own, unfortunately through happenstance. Nobody else is in that house at the time, and Rudy Guede takes advantage of her, and all the forensics shows that he was in the house at the time. And yet, I don't even recall seeing any footage of his trial. It was fast-tracked through the Italian system.
That's true.
And I don't recall there being any noise or publicity about what happened at that trial, about his sentencing.
Despite the millions of people that were watching headlines about Amanda Knox at the same time, there was nothing covering the Guede trial. And what McNeely did was he offered him 30 years for a plea, and that he would, instead of getting life in prison for this rape murder, that he would get a 30-year sentence. And then he fast-tracked it so that would actually get reduced to 16 years. And then he was able to be eligible for daytime release in 7 years.
Well, I mean, why arrest him at all? I mean, it's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. And if you track his
disgusting.
statements and how much he changed from when he was recorded, not knowing he was being recorded, and said Amanda was not there, and he didn't even know who Raphael was. From that to, oh yes, I saw the silhouette of Amanda running away from the apartment out the window. When I was holding Meredith Kircher, she was dying in my arms. This crap, this complete lie, this vicious killer is trying to use Meredith as his alibi here. And then he says, well, Raphael could have been the guy who threatened me with a knife, but I didn't get a good look at him. So what McNeely did, he ran after Rudy Guede testified about this in his trial. And of course, Amanda and Raphael were not there to defend themselves. They had no representatives there. They were still in jail awaiting trial. And so he's basically putting that evidence in when nobody can refute it. And then after they convict Rudy Guede, McNeely immediately very quickly gets the Supreme Court of Italy to certify the verdict. And what that means is no other court in the land of Italy could ever go against that certification. When Amanda and Raphael appealed their original conviction, he never got that certified. He never did what a prosecutor is supposed to do in that case. He never got it certified. So the original one with Guede was certified, and their appeal was not certified. So when it went up to the Supreme Court said, oh, well, we already have a finding that was certified that Rudy Guede says that Amanda and Raphael were involved, so we have to throw out their overturned conviction. I mean, it's really convoluted here. So now the Supreme Court says, we can't uphold your successful appeal. We have to throw it back for a new trial. And that's why we had yet another trial. And the Supreme Court panel actually looked at all the evidence. Fortunately, they drilled down into the underlying case and didn't just go by the certified verdict that McNeely had handed them. And they found that there was absolutely nothing, not a scintilla of evidence that supported McNeely's theories or what they were prosecuted for. And they were absolutely, not only was the case dismissed, he exonerated them. And that was a major move. And that's something that courts rarely do. But in this case, they felt it was necessary because there had been so much wrong, misleading, negative press, and misleading statements by the prosecution.
Yeah, and I think, the report found, and the Supreme Court said, that there were stunning flaws in the investigation. I mean, I still feel that there was no real sense of an investigation. And
it was a witch hunt, right?
It really was, of just trying to fit everything to this female who had been demonized because he felt that on the basis of looking at Meredith Kercher and looking at her, that they were two very different people, and that somehow Amanda Knox, had this rampant sex life, which she never had, incidentally, even through her own diaries. And yet Meredith, he had said was the somebody who was so polar opposite, but that Amanda just wasn't behaving in the way that in his mind a female should behave. And I think herein lies some of the underlying misogyny. We haven't mentioned the M word, but it is absolutely there and present, not just within the system, the criminal justice system, and the judgments of some of those professionals, but also within the media. And, it certainly wasn't about just stunning flaws on its own. And certainly the increased media attention did create this platform for someone like him. He was feeding, creating the feeding frenzy, but at the same time, he was trying to, make his own name. And these injustices, happened. And as you mentioned, Jim, there was a complete lack of any biological trace connecting them to the crime scene. So, how this could have happened, because remember, they were convicted not just once, but they were convicted twice. They were then acquitted, and then they were, convicted again, which, again, the system on its own is trying to get, our minds around how their system works is one thing. But, certainly those years that they will never get back, where I can't remember how many times when the documentary opens up, it says, if you put Amanda Knox's name into Google, it comes up.
4 billion times.
Yeah.
Even if you put in Meredith Kercher's name, Amanda Knox comes up much more than she does. Details of Amanda.
And that's the terrifying thing about what happened. The victim doesn't come up in terms of any detail about who she was, but yet the focus was always around Amanda Knox. And yet, what the Supreme Court said was that there's still overwhelming evidence pointing to the guilt of Rude Gide. But yet again, he seems to have just been disappeared out of all of this, along with the victim, Meredith Kercher.
Right. And it's so unusual to have a situation in which you have a convicted murderer.
Rapist
murderer. And yet he is not newsworthy.
And the system's protecting him. That's how it feels, and that's how it looks, that he was protected in many senses by this lawyer who's trying to fast track his case and get the best deal for him. And he's then manipulating the system too.
Yeah, but I don't think he could have done it without the cooperation of the prosecutor. The prosecutor so much wanted to get evidence against Amanda and Raphael that he bent over backwards to placate the defense, Rudy's defense attorney, and gave him a stellar deal. A man who should be in jail for life, ended up in 7 years eligible to go out on day release.
It just makes a mockery out of the system, and that's why I just wonder about the redress. How does the family get redress? The Meredith's family, as well as the other families, the Knox family and Sollecito, is it the pronunciation? Sollecito.
Yeah.
His family, and all those who are swept up in it, because they are equally, people who deserve to have some form of redress. And the people within the system just seem to have escaped, or some have been promoted, and where it does smack of collusion, absolutely, of a number of people, and it seems to be without any repercussions.
Right. Well, all we can do is sort of put it out there that to our listeners and to the families of Meredith Kercher and Amanda Knox and Raphael Sollecito, that if there are questions that we can answer for you, if we can explain things that went on in this quote investigation and the prosecution of this case, and And that night, that fateful night where Meredith was brutally murdered, if we can answer questions for you, we'd be very happy too. And I don't mean just on the air. We can certainly do that offline as well. But we are always keeping in mind that Meredith Kercher was a human being who her life was brutally taken from her, and she needs to have her own voice, and we're trying to help bring her voice to her.
Yeah, her life was brutally and violently ended,
It's
and
terrible.
I just can't even imagine how that must have felt, being in the house on her own and then understanding, her last moments must have been terrifying. And I do think, people just genuinely don't understand the violence that this crime entailed. And it was very much a distraction. And, certainly what the media did was create a very different type of crime from that which happened. And, I think there's still much more to learn from this case, and
Right.
much more that we can discuss just about, the Italian system itself, the Netflix documentary, how it was kind of
there's so much
put
more.
together.
Yeah. Well, what we should do is when you hear this, you can write in questions,
Yeah.
and we'll try to address them in future podcasts. And because we'll be talking about this for a little while longer.
I think so.
Because
And
there are so many details in this case.
And there's so many books that I still want to get caught up on. John Kercher, Meredith's father, wrote a book about her, and which I've read just the beginning of it. But apparently, he was very much influenced by, of course, the police and the prosecutors in Italy, and very much, I think, believes their findings. So, but there's so much more I want to do my research too.
It would be interesting to know when he wrote that, and whether he now believes the finding of the highest court in Italy and the very, very specific findings that they made.
Yeah, it's 2012 is when this was published.
Okay, so clearly he wasn't aware of the final decision in this case, and by a panel of judges that actually reviewed all the evidence in the case. But it's unfortunate that he was subject to so much torturous misinformation that was put out there. But again, if there's any way that we can help him and the rest of his family understand what really happened, we'd be happy to do that.
And I certainly would want nobody else on this case but you guys, because I know that you mean what you say, and you will definitely try to help if you can. And so,
We're interested in the facts and the evidence, and unfortunately they they didn't really play a role in this case right from the start. So we do want to redress the balance there.
Okay, so
Well,
next
thank you,
time-
everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time on Real Crime Profile.
Signing off on Real Crime Profile.
So if you enjoy our podcast and would like to support us, there are a couple of important things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and give us a positive 5-star review. You can check out our sponsors and take advantage of the special promotions for Real Crime Profile listeners. You can go over and like our Facebook page, and you can follow us on Twitter. But most importantly, you can share our podcast with friends, family, and anyone you know would be interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. So thank you for listening.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clementi. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website www.genesisshelter.org, or the Domestic Violence Hotline on 800-799-7233.
If If you're a regular listener to the show, you know we have great brands like Blue Apron, Audible, and Casper advertising with us, and they keep coming back because our listeners really respond to them, which we're really thankful for. Well, if you happen to own a business or manage the advertising buy for one, then you should consider advertising on Real Crime Profile. Podcast advertising is on the rise, and it's one of the most effective ways of reaching consumers on the go today. So please go to Wondery.com/advertisers. Again, it's Wondery.com/advertisers and get in touch with us. Thanks.